The camera flash caught them both off guard. Claire Whitfield's heels slid on the wet planks of the pier, and before she could reach for the railing, David Calloway's hand was already at her waist, steady, certain, like he had done it 100 times before. A local reporter lowered her phone and smiled. "What does your husband do for a living?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it, looked at David, whose grip had not loosened. Then she smiled back at the reporter and said nothing at all. Before this story unfolds any further, here is a question worth sitting with. If you had 1 second to correct a stranger's mistake, and correcting it meant letting go of something you didn't know you wanted, would you say the truth, or would you stay quiet? 6 weeks earlier, the Isle of Hope dock smelled like low tide and cedar shavings, and David Calloway was on his knees in the belly of a 42-foot sailboat, running his palm along a hull seam that had been leaking for longer than the owner wanted to admit. He worked with the kind of patience that didn't announce itself. His daughter, Wren, sat cross-legged on the dock above him, humming while she sorted screws into a coffee can by size, a habit her father had taught her without ever calling it a lesson. Claire arrived at 10 minutes past 9, in low heels that were wrong for the dock and a blazer that was wrong for the heat, and she stood at the edge of the gangway for a moment before she called down into the hull, "Mr. Calloway?" He looked up, sawdust on his forearm, sun already deep in his skin, eyes that took a second longer than most people's to focus on a stranger. "That's me, Claire Whitfield. I called about the boat." He didn't recognize the name the way most people in Savannah would have, the way that made people straighten their collars or lower their voices. He just nodded and wiped his hand on his jeans before offering it to help her down the ladder, which she did not take and then took anyway, because the alternative was undignified in a skirt. The boat, she explained, had belonged to her grandfather, and it needed to be seaworthy, or at least seaworthy looking in time for the reopening gala of the Whitfield Heritage Inn at the end of the month. David asked practical questions. Draft, age of the hull, whether she wanted it to actually sail or just sit pretty at the dock for photographs. She hadn't expected the question, and she found she didn't have a fast answer. "Both, I think," she said. "It should be able to do the thing it's for, even if nobody asks it to." He looked at her a beat too long, the way a man looks at a sentence he didn't expect to hear from someone in a blazer. "I can do that," he said. Wren leaned over the dock rail, upside down, hair swinging. "Is she going to be here a lot?" Wren. David didn't look up, but there was a smile in it. "I don't know," Claire said honestly, surprised at the question, surprised more at how much she wanted the answer to be yes. "Probably to check on the progress." "We're slow," David said. "Fair warning, I like slow things done right." It was a small sentence. It shouldn't have landed the way it did, but something in the way he held her gaze a half-second longer than the conversation required made the air on the dock feel different than it had 5 minutes earlier, and neither of them mentioned it, and neither of them forgot it. Over the following days, Claire found reasons to return that had less to do with fiberglass and more to do with the particular quiet of the dock at that hour. The smell of diesel and salt, the sight of a man who worked with his hands like the work itself mattered, not just the money at the end of it. She watched him crouch to Wren's height to explain why a knot held, watched him listen, actually listen to an 8-year-old's opinion on paint colors, as though it carried real weight. She had forgotten, somewhere in the last decade of board meetings and quarterly projections, what it looked like when someone had nothing to prove. "You're staring at my boat like it insulted you," David said one afternoon, not looking up from the transom he was sanding. "I'm thinking about the boat." "About the boat," she agreed, and neither of them believed her, and neither of them said so. By the end of the second week, she had scheduled a progress check for a boat that, by any reasonable measure, did not need checking twice in 1 week. She told herself it was due diligence. She told herself several things that week that were not entirely true. The notebook was open on the workbench when Claire came down the ladder one gray Tuesday, and she wasn't trying to look. It was just there, pages fanned by the harbor wind, and the drawings on it stopped her mid-sentence. They weren't sketches of a sailboat hull. They were technical drawings, hull sections, load calculations, weight distribution tables in a tight, precise hand. The kind of work she had seen exactly once before, in a glass-walled conference room in Boston, on a screen belonging to a naval architecture firm her family's company had once tried to acquire. "What is this?" she asked, and something in her voice made David look up fast. He closed the notebook without seeming to rush, which was its own kind of rushing. "Old habit." "This isn't a habit, David. This is a full displacement analysis." She tapped the cover, not opening it again, giving him that much. I've sat across a table from people who do this for a living. You're better than most of them. I used to tinker. Tinker, she repeated, and let it sit there, unconvinced, but not pushing. It was Hollis Bragg, the dockmaster, who broke it without meaning to, 3 days later, hollering across the boatyard about a delivery. Calloway, get your engineer's eyes over here. Tell me if this bracket's rated for the weight. David's jaw went tight. Hollis caught himself half a second too late, glanced at Claire, and busied himself with a clipboard like it might swallow him whole. Claire didn't press. She watched David's shoulders, the careful stillness of a man waiting to see if a door had actually been opened, or if he could still pretend it hadn't. She thought of a dozen questions. She asked none of them. Instead, she said, "The bracket's fine, for what it's worth," because she'd seen enough site inspections to know that much, and she walked back toward her car without turning around. She didn't understand, fully, why she'd let it go, only that something in her recognized the exact shape of a man protecting a life he used to have, and some part of her, the part that had spent 15 years being asked to explain, justify, and account for every choice she made, respected the privacy of it more than she wanted the answer. David watched her go, uncertain what had just happened between them, only certain that it wasn't nothing. She had seen the truth sitting right there on the workbench, and instead of pulling at the thread, she'd left it exactly where it was. That night, after Wren was asleep, David sat on the back porch with a beer he didn't finish, turning the notebook over in his hands. He hadn't opened it in months. He'd told himself it was for calculations he might still need for the boat, not for the pull of something he'd sworn off 5 years ago on a rooftop in Boston, standing over a hospital parking lot, promising a God he wasn't sure. He believed in that he would never again let a blueprint matter more than his daughter's bedtime. He thought about the look on Claire's face when she'd seen the drawings, not triumph, not curiosity dressed up as gossip, but something closer to recognition, like she too was carrying something people didn't ask about because they were afraid of the answer. He didn't know what to do with a woman who found his secret and chose, deliberately, not to use it. 3 miles away, in a house too large for one person, Claire sat at her kitchen island with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, replaying the moment on the dock. She could have asked. She was good at asking. It was, in some ways, the only skill her family had ever properly taught her, but she had watched David Calloway's hands go still around that notebook, and some old, tired part of her had thought, everyone in my life asks me for something. I don't have to be one more person doing that to him. She didn't have a name yet for what she was feeling. She only knew that she had learned something true about the man on the dock, and that the not saying it felt, unexpectedly, like the beginning of trust. The conference room on the 14th floor smelled like fresh coffee and old money, and Preston Whitfield sat at the head of the table like he already owned the chair, which technically he did not. "You've missed 2 site walkthroughs this month," he said, sliding a folder across the polished wood without looking at Claire directly. "The board is asking questions. The board asked me to deliver a boat for the reopening." "I'm delivering a boat." "The board asked you to deliver a hospitality relaunch that convinces 4 regional investors this family still knows how to run a company." Preston's voice stayed level, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. "Instead, you're spending your mornings at a boat dock with a repairman. His name is David Calloway, and he's the best hull man on this coast, which you'd know if you'd ever set foot on that dock yourself." Preston smiled the way he always did when he was losing an argument and wanted her to think otherwise. "I'm not questioning his skill. I'm questioning your priorities." Claire held his gaze until he looked away first, which he always did eventually, though it cost her more than she let show. She gathered her folder and left before the conversation could go anywhere further, and she told herself, walking to the elevator, that Preston's opinion of her schedule was not worth the headache building behind her eyes. She ended up at the dock anyway, an hour later, telling herself it was to check the mainsail rigging. David and Wren were at the ice cream stand 2 blocks down. David crouched on the curb so he was eye level with his daughter while she deliberated between 2 flavors, like the fate of the harbor depended on it. Claire almost kept walking. Then Wren spotted her. "Miss Claire, come tell my dad that mint chip is a real flavor and not weird." "It's not weird," Claire said, arriving at the curb, feeling suddenly and strangely nervous, the way she hadn't felt walking into rooms with 9-figure decisions on the table. "See?" Wren said, triumphant, and made room on the curb without asking anyone's permission, the unthinking generosity of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned that adults were supposed to negotiate their way into each other's afternoons. David glanced up at Claire, a silent question in it, an offer she could decline, and she sat down on the curb next to his daughter in a blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and ate a scoop of butter pecan out of a paper cup with a small wooden spoon, and for 11 unhurried minutes she was not the CEO of anything. She was just a woman on a curb, listening to a little girl explain with total conviction why the dolphins near the marina probably had names, even though nobody had asked them. David didn't say much. He watched Ren, and once or twice he watched Claire watching Ren, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You're good at this," Claire said quietly, while Ren ran ahead to press her nose against a bakery window. "At ice cream?" "At this. All of it." She gestured, vaguely, at the whole unhurried shape of the afternoon. "I don't know how to do this. You're doing it right now." She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her more than anything he could have said. From the window of a parked car across the street, Preston watched the three of them on the curb, the CEO, the repairman, the child between them, like they belonged to each other, and something in his expression sharpened into calculation. He didn't know yet what he would do with what he was looking at, but he filed it away, the way he filed away everything that might someday be useful, and he drove off before Claire could see his car. The night before the gala, the dock was empty except for the two of them, the water black and quiet under the hull lights, the boat finally finished, finally right. Claire had come to check the rigging one last time, or so she'd told herself in the car, though she suspected David saw through the excuse the way he seemed to see through most things she said without meaning to reveal. "Wind's picking up," he said, and before she could answer, he was draping his jacket over her shoulders, the canvas still warm from his body, smelling like cedar and salt. She didn't say thank you. It didn't seem like the kind of gesture that needed one, and some instinct told her that saying it out loud would make it smaller than it was. They stood at the bow, close enough that their arms nearly touched, watching the harbor lights ripple on the water. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "Go ahead. Does it ever feel like you're supposed to be someone, and you're not sure you want to be them anymore?" He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then, every day for about 2 years. Then one day it stopped. "What changed?" "I stopped asking myself who I was supposed to be, and started asking who Ren needed me to be." He looked at her sideways. "That's not an answer to your question, is it?" "It's a better one than I was going to give myself." She told him then, in pieces, about the company her grandfather built and her father expanded, and she was now expected to carry, without dropping, about board members who watched her for the first crack, about a name that opened doors, and also closed them, because no one ever quite believed she'd walk through on her own. David didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. The way he listened to Ren explain dolphin names, like the thing she was saying mattered simply because she was the one saying it. "You don't have to prove you deserve the chair," he said finally. "You already have it. The only question left is what you do with it. That's either very wise or very simple. Might be both." A line came loose at the stern, and they both reached for it at the same moment, hands closing near enough to touch, close enough that she felt the warmth of his skin before either of them pulled back. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them looked away first, not right away. "I should go," Claire said, not moving. "Probably," David said, not moving either. Eventually she did go, jacket still on her shoulders, and she didn't take it off until she was home, sitting at her kitchen island in the dark, smiling at nothing in particular, and aware for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit that tomorrow's gala did not feel like the thing she was most looking forward to. Somewhere underneath the calendar and the quarterly reports, a different question had started to form, one she wasn't ready to say out loud. What if going back to being only the CEO, after this, felt like losing something she hadn't known she had? David stood on the dock a long while after her taillights disappeared, the empty jacket hanger swinging faintly against the cabin wall, and found himself thinking, for the first time since Sarah, that a house could feel less quiet with the right person in it, and that the thought didn't scare him as much as he expected it to. The gala filled the pier with string lights and the low hum of a string quartet, and the restored boat sat gleaming at the dock like it had never known a leak in its life. Claire moved through the crowd in a navy dress, shaking hands, thanking donors, doing the version of herself that Savannah expected to see. David stood near the boat in a jacket that didn't quite fit the occasion, watching her work the room, feeling out of place in a way he hadn't felt since Boston, and finding, strangely, that he didn't mind it as much as he thought he would. It happened fast. Claire stepped toward the gangway to pose for a photo beside the restored hull, her heel catching on a wet plank slick with harbor spray, and David crossed the distance without thinking, his hand finding her waist before her balance was even fully gone. She caught herself against his chest, laughing, breathless, and for a moment neither of them moved, because moving would have meant acknowledging how natural it had felt. The reporter's flash went off before either of them noticed her. "That's a great shot," the woman said, lowering her phone with a smile. "Already typing. What does your husband do for a living?" Claire felt the question land somewhere just beneath her ribs. The truth was a simple sentence away. "He's not my husband. He's the man who restored my grandfather's boat," and she opened her mouth fully intending to say it. But David's hand hadn't left her waist, and some part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime being defined by boardrooms and bylines, and a last name she didn't choose, did not want to hand this moment over to correction, did not want to watch it become, in print tomorrow, a footnote about a hired contractor instead of what it had actually felt like, standing here, caught. She smiled instead. "He keeps things afloat," she said, which was true, and answered nothing, and the reporter laughed and wrote it down exactly as if it had been an answer. David said nothing at all. He felt her weight settle back onto her own feet, felt the small, deliberate stillness of her not stepping away from him, and understood, without being told, that something had just been decided between them without either of them using words for it. Neither corrected the record for the rest of the evening. Not when a donor congratulated Claire on her marriage. Not when the harbor master's wife asked David how long they'd been together and he answered, "Feels like a while," which was true in every sense except the one being asked about. By the time the string lights dimmed and the last guests wandered toward their cars, Claire and David stood at the end of the dock, alone again, the boat rocking gently behind them. "You didn't say anything," David said finally. "Neither did you." "I didn't know what to say." "Neither did I," Claire admitted, and it was the most honest thing either of them had said all night. The photograph ran the next morning on the Savannah Coastal Herald's community page, above a caption that read, "CEO Claire Whitfield and her husband celebrate the reopening of the historic Whitfield Heritage Inn." By 9 a.m., it had been shared across half the town's group chats. By noon, someone had forwarded it to Preston Whitfield, who read the caption twice, set down his coffee, and began making a phone call he had been waiting weeks for a reason to make. The emergency board session was called for Thursday morning, and Preston made sure every member had a printed copy of the article before they sat down. "I'm not interested in her personal life," he said, which was a lie so smooth it almost sounded like the truth. "I'm interested in whether this company is being led by someone the public actually knows anything about. A CEO who lets a false story run uncorrected for 4 days is a CEO who either can't control her own narrative or doesn't think she owes this board the truth. Neither is acceptable heading into a merger conversation with investors who are already nervous." Claire sat at the far end of the table, spine straight, aware of every eye in the room. The story is a caption under a photograph. It's not a merger document, it's a perception problem, Claire. And perception is the entire business we're in. Preston folded his hands. "I'd like to propose that the board formally request a public statement from you, correcting the record, before Friday's press cycle closes." She could feel the room leaning toward him, the particular gravity Preston always managed to generate in that building, and she understood, with a small cold drop in her stomach, that this was no longer about a caption. It was about whether she still had the authority to decide what she did and didn't have to explain about her own life. It was Hollis Bragg who changed the shape of the room, though nobody on that board had expected to see a dockmaster in a boardroom that morning. He'd asked David the night before, standing in the boatyard with his cap in his hands like a man at a funeral. "I can't watch that girl get taken apart by that snake, while the one thing that'd stop him sits locked up in your workshop," he'd said. "Let me say it, David. Just the work. Nothing else." David had stood a long time before answering, jaw tight, the old fear rising in him, the fear of being known again, of a name following him back into rooms he'd spent 5 years avoiding. "Just the work," he'd finally said. "Not Sarah, not why I left. That part stays mine." Hollis had given his word, and now he stood at the head of the boardroom table in his work boots, a folder in his hand that looked entirely out of place among the tablets and tailored suits. "Before you vote on anything," Hollis said, "you ought to know who you're talking about." He set the folder down and opened it to a page of technical drawings, patent filings, a hull design with David Calloway's name printed clean at the bottom corner. "David Calloway isn't some feller off the street fixing your family's boat for beer money. He designed the hull system that's still licensed by 3 shipbuilders on the eastern seaboard, including one that partnered with this very company on the Charleston Harbor project 6 years back. He walked away from that career on his own terms. He didn't run from anything you need to be ashamed of. The room went still in a way boardrooms rarely do. One member flipped through the patent filings twice, as if the second read might change what the first had said. Preston's mouth opened and then closed, the ground shifting under an argument he hadn't prepared to lose. Claire sat frozen for a different reason entirely. She looked at the folder, at the name she already knew, at a truth. She had chosen not to chase down herself out of something like respect, and understood that Hollis had just handed her a weapon she had never asked for and wasn't sure she wanted to use. After the meeting adjourned in confusion, no vote taken, Claire found Hollis in the hallway. "Does David know you did this?" "He gave me his word I'd say it before I said it," Hollis said. "That's more than most men would have offered." Claire nodded slowly, already turning the next question over in her mind, the one that mattered more than anything Preston could put to a vote. Not whether to use what she now knew, but whether David would ever forgive the world for finding out, and whether she had any right to decide, on his behalf, how much of him the town got to see. Preston moved fast after the board meeting, faster than Claire expected, arranging a press conference for Friday afternoon under the banner of transparency for our investors, a phrase he'd clearly rehearsed in a mirror. He wanted her to stand in front of the cameras and correct the record herself, publicly, on his terms, in his timeline, one more small surrender that would look, to anyone watching, like his idea all along. She almost let him win it by default. It would have been easier. A single sentence, "He's not my husband, he's a contractor." The story was never true, and the whole thing would be over by dinner. Instead, standing at the small podium set up outside the Whitfield Heritage Inn, with half the town and every local camera pointed at her, Claire found David in the crowd before she found her opening line, Wren's small hand tucked in his, and something in her chest settled. "4 days ago, a reporter asked a question, and I didn't correct her answer," Claire said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "I want to be honest about why. It wasn't a mistake I let stand because I was careless. It was a moment I didn't want to give away by explaining it." She paused, let the silence hold. "David Calloway is not my husband. He is a man who restored my grandfather's boat with more care than most people give to things they actually own. He has a daughter he is raising alone, and he does it better than almost anyone I have ever watched try. Before this week, he also had a career most of you never knew about, because he chose, on his own terms, to leave it behind. That choice was his. It still is. I won't be the one standing up here explaining the rest of it to you, because it was never mine to explain." She looked out at the crowd, found Preston's face among the board members near the front, his composure cracking at the edges. "What I will say is this. I am the CEO of this company because I've earned every part of that chair, not because of who I stand next to at a party. If this board needs a public statement to feel confident in my leadership, I'd suggest looking at the numbers I've delivered this quarter, not a caption under a photograph." For a moment nobody moved. Then, from the edge of the crowd, David let go of Wren's hand and stepped forward, unhurried, the way he crossed a dock, and came to stand beside Claire at the podium. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't say a word. He simply set his hand lightly against her shoulder, steady, the same way he'd steadied her on the wet plank weeks before, and looked out at the cameras like a man who had decided finally that he would rather be seen standing next to her than protected by staying invisible. The silence that followed had weight to it. Somewhere in the back, a reporter lowered her phone without taking the shot she'd been ready to take. Preston stood very still, his prepared statement folded uselessly in his jacket pocket, watching a plan built on someone else's discomfort fail to find any discomfort left to use. Claire didn't look at David. She didn't need to. She could feel the warmth of his hand through her blazer, could feel the exact moment the whole crowd understood that whatever this was between them, it wasn't going to be explained today, and it wasn't going to be taken apart either. Wren, still at the edge of the podium, watched her father stand beside a woman who had chosen, in front of an entire town, not to let go of him, and though she was only 8, she understood something true was happening, even if she didn't have the words for it yet. The board vote came 3 days later, quiet compared to everything that preceded it. Claire retained her position unanimously, minus one abstention that everyone understood to be Preston's, and by the end of the month, he had resigned from the board entirely, citing differences in strategic vision, a phrase that fooled absolutely no one in Savannah's business circles. He sold his shares and moved his attention to a hotel group 2 states away, and Whitfield Heritage did not miss him. David came to Claire's office that Thursday evening, still in his work clothes, sawdust on his collar, looking entirely out of place among her glass walls and framed acquisitions. He hadn't called ahead. She found she didn't mind. "I never thanked you," he said, "for what you said out there. I never thanked you for standing next to me." He sat across from her, in the chair usually reserved for investors, and for a while neither of them said anything, the office quiet except for the hum of the harbor beyond the window. "I want to tell you something," David said finally, "about why I really left Boston." She waited, giving him the same silence he'd given her on the boat weeks earlier. "My wife, Sarah, she died 5 years ago. Car accident. Not the job. But I was 3 weeks from a deadline when it happened, and I'd missed 2 of Wren's bedtimes that week for a project that, in the end, didn't save anyone's life or change anything that mattered. After the funeral, I looked at every blueprint on my desk and thought, I built boats that could survive hurricanes, and I couldn't be home for the one night my daughter needed me. I walked away because I was scared that if I kept being that good at something, I'd keep choosing it over her, even by accident, even without meaning to." "You're not scared of that anymore?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm scared of a lot of things. I don't know yet if that's still one of them." "I understand being scared of being good at something," Claire said quietly. "Everyone in my family confuses competence with worth. I've spent my whole life terrified that if I ever let myself feel something that wasn't work, someone would decide I wasn't serious enough to keep the chair." She looked at him. "Steady, you didn't make me feel that way. Not once. I wasn't trying to make you feel any particular way." "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." The quiet between them stretched, comfortable now in a way it hadn't been in the boardroom or on the podium, just 2 people, finally saying true things out loud, in a room with no cameras and no board members and no last names attached to the conversation. It was Wren who broke it, 3 days later, sitting between them on the dock at sunset, swinging her legs over the water while David checked a line and Claire watched him do it, the ordinary rhythm of an evening that had started to feel less like a visit and more like a habit. "So are you," like Wren squinted, working out the sentence with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old, asking the question every adult in the scene had been avoiding. "Are you my dad's? Like, are you his person now?" Neither of them answered right away. Claire looked at David. David looked at Claire, and in the space where an answer should have been, something passed between them that didn't need words, an agreement neither of them was ready to name out loud. But neither of them denied either, and Wren, watching both their faces, seemed satisfied enough with that. 3 weeks later, a marine restoration firm out of Charleston reached out to David about consulting on a historic vessel project docked at the Whitfield Heritage Inn itself, a slow, careful restoration that would take the better part of a year. David almost said no out of habit before he'd even heard the terms. Then he heard them. Part-time, local, his own hours, built entirely around Wren's school schedule. No travel, no deadlines that could eat a Tuesday bedtime story. He said yes on one condition, the same condition he'd held onto since Boston. "I pick up my daughter at 3:15 every day. That doesn't move for anybody." They agreed without hesitation, and David hung up the phone and stood in his workshop for a long moment, letting himself feel something he hadn't expected to feel again, the particular, careful pride of being good at something and still being fully present for the people who needed him. It wasn't Boston. It wasn't the version of himself he'd walked away from. It was better, because this time he'd built it on his own terms. Claire started coming to the dock in the evenings without any excuse at all, not a rigging check, not a progress report, just the simple fact that she wanted to be there. She'd trade her heels for the pair of deck shoes she kept in her car now, and sit on an overturned crate while David worked and Wren narrated increasingly elaborate stories about the harbor's wildlife, and for an hour or 2 each evening, none of them needed to be anything other than exactly who they were. Hollis watched it happen from the dockmaster's shed most evenings, arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile he thought nobody noticed. He'd carried David's secret for 5 years like a stone in his pocket, and there was a particular relief in watching the weight of it finally set down. Not because it had been forced out of anyone, but because it had, in the end, made room for something good instead of taking something away. One evening, after Wren had fallen asleep in the truck and David had carried her in, he came back down to the dock and found Claire still there, barefoot on the weathered planks, looking out at the water gone dark and silver under a rising moon. "No camera this time," he said. coming to stand beside her. No camera, she agreed. No reporter asking questions. No reporter. He reached over and took her hand, simply, without ceremony, the way he'd have picked up a tool he'd used 1,000 times before and trusted completely. She didn't pull away. She laced her fingers through his instead, and they stood there a long while, saying nothing, because for the first time in this whole strange, sideways story, nothing needed correcting, and nothing needed to be said out loud to be true. A year to the week after the gala, the same pier filled again with string lights, this time for the Isle of Hope Community Festival, and a smaller affair with paper lanterns instead of press releases, and a band that played requests instead of a string quartet reading from a program. The restored boat still sat at the dock, gleaming, seaworthy in every sense of the word, exactly the way Claire had asked for on the first day she'd met David, though neither of them had known, back then, everything that sentence would come to mean. Ran ahead of them down the pier, 9 years old now, taller, still narrating an unbroken commentary about the dolphins she was certain lived just beyond the marina lights. She grabbed one of David's hands and one of Claire's without breaking stride, pulling them both along like the most natural thing in the world, no explanation required, none ever having been necessary in the first place. A woman Claire didn't recognize stopped them near the dessert table, admiring the boat, admiring, in the easy way strangers do at small-town festivals, the family standing in front of her. "That's a beautiful boat," she said. "Yours?" "My grandfather's, once," Claire said. David restored it. "And what does your husband do for a living?" the woman asked, smiling. An easy, unloaded question, the kind asked 100 times a week at festivals like this one. A year ago, that exact question had hung in the air between them, unanswered, a silence chosen for reasons neither of them had been ready to explain. Tonight, Claire didn't hesitate at all. "He's the best engineer I've ever known," she said, and meant every part of it, not the credential, not the patents in some filing cabinet in Boston, but the whole of him was the man who built things that lasted and stayed for the people who needed him to stay. "He just prefers to build things people actually use." David said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply tightened his hand around hers, the same quiet certainty he'd offered on a wet plank a year earlier, and looked out at the harbor lights, scattered across the water like something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Neither of them had been looking for this. That evening on the dock so many months before, not a marriage mistaken for real, not a secret half-kept, not a girl who asked the questions the adults were too careful to ask themselves. They had simply shown up, day after ordinary day, and let the truth arrive in its own time. Neither of them had been looking, and that was exactly why they had found each other.